Edward Theodore Gein, known as the Butcher of Plainfield, was a quiet, unassuming farmer from Wisconsin whose gruesome crimes shocked the world in the 1950s. He confessed to murdering 2 women, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, but his atrocities extended far beyond those killings. Gein robbed graves, exhumed corpses, and crafted grotesque trophies from human remains, skulls as bedposts, lampshades and chairs upholstered with skin, a belt made of nipples, and a suit stitched from female flesh to embody his deceased mother. In this documentary, we'll peel back the layers of Gein's psyche, using psychology and psychoanalysis to explore the twisted mind behind these horrors, uncovering why he committed such unspeakable acts. Imagine a small, sleepy town where everyone knows your name, where the hardware store owner waves as you pass by, where the air smells of fresh-cut hay and innocence. Now picture that same town frozen in terror, its heart ripped out by one of its own. Ed Gein wasn't just a killer. He was a nightmare made flesh, a man whose crimes were so grotesque they birthed some of the most iconic horror films: Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Silence of the Lambs. We're diving into his story because his acts weren't just violent. They were a psychological puzzle, a chilling case study of a mind warped by trauma, obsession, and madness. His methods, his choices, his creations, they demand we look closer, not just at the blood and bones, but at the why. Picture this: a farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin in 1957. Police step inside and find a decapitated body hanging from the rafters like a butchered deer, gutted and dressed. Skulls line the shelves, human skin stretched over furniture, a shoebox stuffed with preserved vulvas. This wasn't just murder. It was a descent into a private hell, crafted with surgical precision and a deranged devotion to a mother long dead. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand Ed Gein, you have to walk through the shadows of his childhood. Born in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, Ed grew up in a house where love was suffocated by control. His father, George, was a drunk, volatile, and violent. His rage is a constant storm in the Gein household. But it was his mother, Augusta, who shaped Ed's world. Augusta was a fanatical Lutheran, a woman who saw the world as a cesspool of sin, especially women, whom she branded as prostitutes, vessels of evil. She preached to Ed and his older brother, Henry, that sex was a sin, that women were the devil's tools, and that purity was their only salvation. Yet, in a twisted contradiction, she reportedly approved of masturbation, a detail that hints at the confusing, warped moral framework she imposed on her sons. From a psychoanalytic perspective, Augusta was the sun around which Ed's psyche orbited. Her dominance created what psychologists call an enmeshed relationship, where boundaries between mother and child blur, fostering dependency and stifling individuality. Ed idolized her, absorbed her teachings like gospel, but this devotion came at a cost. Augusta isolated her boys, moving them to a remote farm in Plainfield to shield them from the world's corruption. Ed, shy and socially awkward, became her shadow, a mama's boy who never learned to navigate the world beyond her suffocating embrace. This isolation fed into what we now recognize as traits of schizoid personality disorder, a detachment from social relationships, a preference for solitude, and a rich, disturbing inner fantasy life. Ed's childhood wasn't just lonely, it was a pressure cooker for psychological damage. Freudian theory would point to his Oedipal complex, an unconscious desire for the mother, coupled with rivalry toward the father. George's alcoholism and Augusta's verbal abuse toward him likely intensified Ed's view of his father as weak, reinforcing Augusta's godlike status. But there was another figure in this grim family portrait: Henry, Ed's older brother. Henry began to push back against Augusta's control, even starting a relationship outside the family, a rebellion that Ed, still tethered to his mother, couldn't fathom. In 1944, Henry died in a mysterious fire on the family farm. Ed reported him missing, yet led police straight to the body, which had bruises on the head, details that raised suspicions but were ruled accidental. Psychologists might argue this was no accident, but subconscious act elimination, Ed removing a rival who dared challenge Augusta's doctrine. When Augusta died in 1945, Ed's world collapsed. She was his anchor, his moral compass, his everything. Without her, he was a ship adrift in a sea of his own making. Psychoanalytically, her death triggered a psychotic break, a fracture in his already fragile psyche. Ed couldn't let her go, so he kept her alive in his mind, preserving her room as a shrine while the rest of the farmhouse descended into chaos. This is where dissociative identity disorder comes into play, not fully diagnosed in Gein's case, but strongly suggested by his behaviors. It involves the presence of two or more distinct personality states, often formed as a coping mechanism for severe trauma. Ed began to become Augusta, dressing in her clothes, speaking in her voice, and most disturbingly, crafting a suit from human skin to literally embody her. This wasn't just madness. It was a desperate attempt to merge with the mother he'd lost, to reclaim her presence by becoming her. Now, let's talk about the crimes, because this is where the horror truly begins. Picture a cold November day in 1957. Bernice Worden, the local hardware store owner, vanishes. Gein was the last person seen with her. Police arrive at his farmhouse, and what they find defies comprehension. Bernice's body hangs in a shed, decapitated, gutted, her heart removed. The house itself is a nightmare museum. Skulls on bedposts, a wastebasket made of skin, chairs upholstered with human flesh, a belt studded with nipples, and masks crafted from women's faces. A shoebox holds 9 salted vulvas. The head of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner missing since 1954, stares blankly from a shelf. Gein hadn't just killed. He transformed his victims into grotesque art, a macabre tribute to his mother. Why did he do this? From a psychological perspective, Gein's crimes were driven by a toxic mix of necrophilia, fetishism, and transvestic disorder. Necrophilia, the attraction to corpses, manifested in his grave robbing, which he began soon after Augusta's death. He'd dig up bodies of women who resembled his mother, middle-aged maternal figures, preserving their parts to create his woman suit. This suit wasn't just a costume. It was a psychological bridge to Augusta, a way to inhabit her essence. Transvestic disorder, characterized by sexual arousal from cross-dressing, explains his obsession with wearing female skin, a ritual that blended gender confusion with his fixation on his mother. Fetishism, meanwhile, fueled his use of body parts as objects of desire, turning human remains into household items. Gein's choice of victims wasn't random. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden both bore a physical resemblance to Augusta, older women, authoritative, the kind Augusta might despise but whom Ed saw as extensions of her. Psychoanalytically, killing them was a twisted act of displacement, where Ed redirected his rage and unresolved grief toward women who symbolized his mother's dual nature, nurturing yet controlling, pure yet sinful. His method, shooting, decapitating, and butchering, was methodical, almost ritualistic, suggesting a compulsion to control and possess. By skinning and preserving their bodies, he was, in his mind, keeping them alive, just as he kept Augusta alive. Police reports and witness accounts paint a chilling picture. One neighbor recalled Gein showing children Halloween masks that were, in reality, preserved human faces. Another described him as quiet, polite but odd, a man who'd smile shyly while hiding a darkness no one could fathom. The media dubbed him the Ghoul of Plainfield, a moniker that barely captured the depth of his depravity. When police interrogated him, Gein seemed bewildered, as if he couldn't fully grasp the horror of his actions. "I didn't mean to hurt anybody," he said, his voice soft, almost childlike. This detachment suggests schizophrenia, a disorder marked by delusions and a fractured sense of reality. Gein's visions of Augusta, urging him to punish sinful women, point to auditory hallucinations, a hallmark of condition. But let's dig deeper. Gein's crimes weren't just about killing. They were about creation. He saw himself as an artist, sculpting a new reality from flesh and bone. This aligns with narcissistic personality traits, where the individual craves control and admiration, even if only from themselves. His farmhouse, a shrine to his mother and his madness, was his canvas. Psychoanalyst Carl Jung might argue Gein was wrestling with his shadow self, the dark, repressed parts of psyche. Unable to integrate his desires, his grief, his rage, he externalized them the most horrific way possible, crafting a world where he could be both son and mother, creator and destroyer. Gein's descent wasn't just personal. It was cultural. The 1950s were a time of repression, where small-town America hid its darkness behind picket fences. Gein read detective magazines detailing Nazi atrocities and headhunters, feeding his fantasies with real-world horrors. These influences, combined with his isolation and Augusta's teachings, created a perfect storm. He wasn't a calculating predator like Ted Bundy. He was a broken man, a monster in plain sight, as one documentary put it, whose crimes reflected a psyche shattered by trauma and obsession. The end came swiftly. After Bernice Worden's disappearance, police zeroed in on Gein. His arrest in 1957 was almost anticlimactic. No chase, no resistance. He confessed to the murders of Hogan and Worden's, though he claimed only 2 killings, denying others despite the evidence. Found unfit for trial due to insanity, he was committed to a mental hospital. In 1968, deemed competent, he was convicted of Worden's murder, but returned to the hospital, where he died of cancer in 1984. Philosophically, Gein's story forces us to confront the nature of evil. Is it born or made? Existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre might argue Gein's actions were a perverse exercise of freedom, a choice to define himself through horror in a world he saw as meaningless. We're all just flesh. Gein told one victim, a nihilistic view that life's value ends with death. Yet his obsession with preserving flesh suggests a desperate search for meaning, a refusal to let go of the one person who gave his life purpose. His end, alone in a hospital, a curiosity rather than a man, mirrors his life, a tragic, twisted quest for connection, warped by a mind that couldn't escape its own darkness. Ed Gein's legacy lingers in the horror genre, but more than that, it challenges us. His crimes weren't just acts of violence. They were a mirror to the human psyche's deepest fears, loneliness, loss, the hunger to be whole. As you sit there, heart pounding, ask yourself, what shadows lurk in the corners of your own mind? Because Ed Gein wasn't just a monster. He was a man, broken by a world that failed him. And in his failure, he became something far worse.